Hello there. It's Jack, here to welcome you back once again to another episode of the Popcorn Cathedral. Well, we've reached the end of our discussion about the wrong ark, the one we're thankful the filmmakers didn't use. Now, happily, we're going to move on to the right ark. The ark as religious believers understand it, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and why it really is so much better than just a mere MacGuffin. Yes, the right ark of the covenant, but also a few quibbles about what Raiders gets wrong on the subject, but more importantly, the many wonderful things that it gets right. I think you'll agree when we're through that it's not only a more edifying story, but a more interesting one as well. So, join us, won't you?
Okay, friends, Jack and I really are going to take you to Sunday school this time, just like Indy himself did with the Army intelligence men. Specifically, we're going to break down the briefing scene at the beginning of Raiders, one of the great movie exposition scenes, by the way, and compare what the finished movie has to say about the Ark with both Von Daniken's version and the sacred sources. And, like last time, we're also going to use some of the lively audio we saved from the 2018 podcast version that we had so much fun making. So, let's get right into it.
Dr. Jones, now, you must understand that this is all strictly confidential, eh?
I understand.
Yesterday afternoon, our European sections intercepted a German communique that was sent from Cairo to Berlin. Now,
You see, over the last 2 years, the Nazis have had teams of archaeologists running around the world looking for all kinds of religious artifacts. Hitler's a nut on the subject. He's crazy. He's obsessed with the occult.
So, we start with the most basic question of all. Did the Nazis really search the world for religious artifacts? Well, there's only one such item that has any real-life connection to Hitler. He wrote about it in Mein Kampf. And that artifact is the Holy Lance, the so-called Spear of Destiny.
Story creator Phil Kaufman learned about the spear as a teenager, and it seems to have been the thing that inspired him to connect his own independently arrived at electrical arc notions with the Nazis in the first place. Those who've seen the new Dial of Destiny movie probably remember that the spearhead figures prominently in the 1940s flashback scene that opens the film.
What's the truth behind this so-called Spear of Destiny?
The Spear of Longinus.
That's exactly right. Well, the spear is mentioned in the Gospel of John, the 19th chapter. The Gospel says that the Romans planned to break Jesus' legs so that he wouldn't be up there along with the other criminals on the holy day, the Jewish holy day the next day, so that he would go ahead and die more quickly. They were going to break his legs. But just before they did it, they realized that he was already dead and there was no reason to do it. But in order to make sure that he really was dead, John 19:34 says, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a lance, and immediately there came out blood and water. The name of the soldier isn't given in the Gospel of John.
Or any of the other three.
That's right. The name that Jack mentioned a few minutes ago, Longinus, actually comes from a piece of New Testament Apocrypha called the Gospel of Nicodemus, which was written in the 4th century. And it's the one that identifies the soldier as Longinus and says that he was a centurion. But neither of those two facts is in the scriptures. Who knows if it's a real memory or not? The spear that Hitler wrote about was, at that time, housed in the Habsburg Museum in Vienna. It's part of a collection of relics called the Imperial Regalia that had been used for centuries during coronation rites for the Holy Roman Emperor. As such, it would have been a highly desirable thing to obtain for a man planning, as Hitler was, to annex Austria and then assemble a new European empire with himself at its head. The passage in Mein Kampf affirms that the Austrians themselves treated the coronation articles as, quote, magical relics, but does not indicate that Hitler himself considered them as such. In fact, it has a dismissive or even derisive tone that many readers appear to have missed. Another question, is the spear in the Habsburg Museum the real spear? a related question? Again, there's no way to know. There's no reason to think that the spear couldn't or wouldn't have been preserved by the church if possible. And many relics from the early church really are authentic. But none of the three existing claimants to this spear actually has a very good provenance. Another question that arises at this point: did Hitler invade Austria just to steal the Habsburg spear, the way it says in the book? And the answer to this is certainly not. Austria was Hitler's homeland. He considered it part of the greater Germany that he was hoping to create, all German-speaking people under one Reich.
Wherever Germans is spoken, there is Germany.
That's right. So yes, he had plenty of reasons for invading Austria, which was the plan all along. And yes, he did steal the spear, and he did take it to Germany, but he stole everything else in the museum too, as he did with most of the art museums in the nations that he conquered. Back to the more basic question now. Was Hitler a nut, obsessed with the occult? Short answer, no. Mostly people have mixed him up with Alfred Rosenberg, seen here on the left, one of Hitler's early co-conspirators, who really was a nut. In fact, he came out of that Thule Society we talked about last time, which Hitler himself, by the way, was never part of. But Rosenberg briefly worked for Seybottendorf himself, the founder of the Thule Society, editing the Volkischer Beobachter before it became the official Nazi mouthpiece. In 1923, after the failed beer hall putsch, Hitler, who had been imprisoned for treason, appointed Rosenberg as the leader of the National Socialist movement, a position he held until Hitler's release. It is true that Rosenberg later on wrote a book called The Myth of the 20th Century, came out in 1930, which laid out the racial theory of the Nazis. It called for the extinction of the Jews, the things you would expect, but it also contained lots of astrology and neo-paganism, bringing back the ancient Teutonic gods and all the rest of it. Some people have described this book as the charter of Nazism, but was really intended mainly for public consumption. It's a fact that Hitler privately called the book nonsense, and he said it was, quote, stuff that nobody can understand. And he disapproved in general of the pseudo-religious tone of it. In fact, there's a quote that said, this is Hitler, I must insist that Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century is not to be regarded as an expression of the official doctrine of the party. I myself have only given it a cursory glance. And as a matter of fact, after the war, during the Nuremberg trials, the prison psychologist who interviewed all of the Nazi leaders reported that none of the Nazi leaders that he interviewed had read Rosenberg's writings. And Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect and kind of interior minister late in the war, Speer quotes Hitler as having said this about Himmler's attempts to mythologize the SS, quote, "What nonsense! Here we have at last reached an age that has left all mysticism behind it, and now Himmler wants to start all that over again. We might just as well have stayed with the church. At least it had tradition." So
pretty fascinating.
Interesting, yes. Anyway, Hitler's nuttiness on this subject makes for a great story, but it's got no real basis in fact. In other words, this isn't so much something Raiders gets wrong as a story Raiders deliberately tells wrong. You may remember from episode 1 of this series that films like Mask of Fu Manchu and Secret Service in Darkest Africa had been using the ruthless leader seeks religious artifacts to use in world conquest long before Raiders was ever thought up.
Tanis development proceeding. Acquire headpiece, staff of Ra, Abner, Ravenwood, U.S.
Nazis have discovered Tanis.
Just what does that mean to you, Tanis?
Well,
The city of Tanis is one of the possible resting places of the Lost Ark.
The Lost Ark.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest the Hebrews used to carry around the Ten Commandments.
What do you mean, Commandments? You're talking about the Ten Commandments?
Yes, the actual Ten Commandments, the original stone tablets that Moses brought down out of Mount Horeb and smashed, if you believe in that sort of thing. You guys ever go to Sunday school?
Well,
Oh, look.
Finally, we get to the real Ark at last, not the Nutty Von Doniken version. So,
Yeah. Amen to that.
right. First of all, I think probably many of you might have wondered, as I have, about Mount Horeb. Didn't Moses meet with God on Mount Sinai? Well,
I was under that impression, actually. I mean, certainly.
right.
I mean,
Well, the answer to this is that the Old Testament uses both of those names. And we don't really know why.
so do we know...
I wish I could say it's as simple as it's just two different names for the same place, but we really don't know.
Now, are there... Okay, so we don't know. There aren't two different mountains, one called Horeb, one called Sinai, right? I mean,
St. Jerome, who lived in the 4th century, and also John Calvin, later on, the Protestant reformer, both thought that they were just two different names for the same place.
Yeah.
And they had various reasons for arguments in favor of this. But other experts think that Horeb was maybe the name for the whole range of mountains, and Sinai just for the one specific peak where Moses met with God. Another interesting fact to factor into the discussion is that the name Horeb isn't used at all in the New Testament, only Sinai, which is probably why people like us are more familiar with that usage. But in the Old Testament, they're both used pretty much intermittently, and we don't really know why.
Pretty interesting, though, definitely.
But Indy is perfectly within his rights to say that the Ten Commandments were given at Mount Horeb. Indy also says, if you've noticed, that the Ark contained the actual tablets, the ones that Moses smashed.
The Ten Commandments.
Right. Well, once again, it isn't quite as simple as that. The Bible doesn't really say anything about the broken pieces. In fact, Exodus 40 and Deuteronomy 10 both specifically say that it was the second set, the one made by Moses, that was put into the ark.
Interesting.
Also interesting, the New Testament book of Hebrews tells us that several other objects were put inside as well. Here's Hebrews 9:4. The Holy of Holies sheltered, quote, the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, which contained a golden urn containing the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, end quote. Well, the manna, of course, was the miraculous bread that came down from heaven during the Exodus to feed the Israelites on the journey. Aaron's rod that miraculously budded out blossoms, flowers, in Numbers 17,
Yeah.
to show that God had chosen Aaron's family for the priesthood and not other claimants who were making a row at the time. So the writer of Hebrews says that both of these things were there. Interesting, 1 Kings 8, verse 9, which was written long before the epistle of the Hebrews, says that when the ark was placed in the temple at Jerusalem, it contained only the tablets inscribed with the Ten Commandments. So what gives here? Is this a contradiction? It's quite a puzzle. Well, let's take just a second and work it out. First of all, the fact that the broken pieces of the first set of tablets were also placed in the ark is an extra biblical tradition that's not in the Bible, but is in the Talmud. The Talmud is the central text of rabbinical Judaism, which was compiled between the 2nd and the 6th centuries AD. It contains a collection of old Jewish traditions not included within the Old Testament itself. So we'll see more of these as we go, these extra biblical traditions that give us additional details about Old Testament subjects. Also worth noting, the author of 1 Kings is really describing the ark's contents at the time that it was installed in the first temple. whereas the author of Hebrews only describes what Moses had put in it or with it in the wilderness several hundred years before the temple was built. So these other articles could very well have been in it originally and separated from it later, perhaps when it was taken captive by the Philistines at one point, and we'll talk more about that as we go.
Now, what does this ark look like?
There's a picture of it right here. That's it.
Good God.
Yes, that's just what the Hebrews thought.
Now what's that supposed to be coming out of there?
Lightning. Fire. Power of God or something.
Beginning to understand Hitler's interest in this.
Oh, yes. The Bible speaks of the Ark leveling mountains and laying waste to entire regions. An army which carries the Ark before it is invincible.
Well, one of the most amusing conceits in the movie is the picture of the Ark we see in this old Bible that Andy opens. It looks like an engraving by Gustav Doré, the famous Bible illustrator, but it isn't. It's not really. It was actually commissioned specifically for Raiders.
Not that.
Because the filmmakers couldn't find a genuine picture on the subject that showed exactly what they were after. It's actually a piece of artwork done by Ralph McQuarrie, who's the main guy behind the look of the Star Wars films.
Yeah.
But he apes the Doré style beautifully. And so I've just found this out recently, and it's a pretty amusing idea.
That's cool.
Well, very dramatic scene. How much of it is the truth? Well, it certainly is the truth that the Ark was a dangerous thing to be around. The first calamity involved Moses' own nephews, Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron. As Levites, they were allowed to minister before the ark, but, quote, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, such as he had not commanded them. And fire came forth from the presence of the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord.
Wow.
Well, what does this strange fire mean? Well, the Hebrew word translated strange means unauthorized, foreign, or profane. Now, nobody knows for sure, but I wonder if what happened here was that Moses' nephews tried to mix some of the true worship of Yahweh with the rites of Egypt, to which the people had become addicted during their bondage. Same instinct that led them to make a golden calf, if you remember. And if you remember, during that golden calf incident, Aaron, their father, seems to have tried to reinterpret the worship that the people insisted on offering to the golden calf as a kind of a syncretistic blend of both rites. He after making the calf, Aaron tells the people, okay, we've made this calf. Now tomorrow we will celebrate a feast to the Lord. So he seems to be trying to pull off the idea that we can offer worship to the Egyptian bull god Apis, and then we can sort of say, well, it's really just passing through there and going on to Yahweh. Well, how about this idea that the ark gave out lightning or fire or the power of God?
Several hundred volts.
Might be wise to remember here what the Chariots of the Gods film said last week.
The Bible says the ark bristled with sparks and bright flashes, as in these old paintings. Indeed, when Moses had erected the ark, the Lord would speak to him through it.
A skeptical reviewer of the book actually challenged von Daniken about this in a private interview. Quote, without actually consulting Exodus, von Daniken said, I seem to remember that the ark was often surrounded by flashing sparks and tubes of fire. Well, the skeptic comes back and says, I did consult Exodus and found no mention of flashing sparks or fire. Well, he's right. There are no sparks or lightning or fire in the Bible, but these things are in the Talmud. and other extra-biblical Jewish sources. In several passages in the Talmud, we're told that the bearers, the men who carried the ark, were sometimes killed by, quote, sparks, which the ark emitted. Also, that the bearers were lifted bodily off the ground at times because, quote, the ark was capable of carrying its carriers as well as itself. End quote.
Man.
And then
Wow.
another midrash says that the ark became weightless as the bearers carried it across the Jordan River. So,
Pretty incredible.
by the way, the Bible only says
Amazing.
the Bible only says that the river grew dry as soon as the feet of the priests carrying the ark touched the water. Another source says that 2 sparks, described elsewhere as fiery jets, quote, issued from the cherubim which shaded the ark, sparks which sometimes burned and destroyed nearby objects. So, von Daniken is wrong about these things being in the Bible, but he didn't just make them up either. Something he does seem to have just made up, though, or perhaps it was his ghostwriter, Uterman, is the bit about the replica made by the college students.
In 1961, a group of Minnesota college students took Moses seriously enough to construct an ark according to his directions. Their instructor, however, had to have the model destroyed because of the dangerously high electrical charge it developed.
Well, an anthropologist from Sydney University named Dr. Peter White tried to track this story down to its source. In fact, he made extensive inquiries at the University of Minnesota and other schools. No record of the Ark of the Covenant project. So our skeptical interviewer from a few minutes ago took these results to von Daniken himself. He says, quote, when I asked Mr. von Daniken about it, he said, it was some high school in Michigan. So, if you stop to think of it, the story's ridiculous on the face of it. I mean, where would a group of college or high school students get...
Much less high school students.
Yes, get authentic Middle Eastern shittim wood or the 100 pounds or so of pure gold that they would need
required
to make an accurate replica of the ark. So...
it's a little bit hard to swallow.
We might also add that there's nothing in either the Bible or the Talmud about opposing plates charged with positive and negative electricity. So there is stuff that just seems to have been made up whole cloth. Well, what about this business of leveling mountains and laying waste to whole regions? I often remember watching the movie and thinking, I don't remember that from the Bible. Well, it isn't in the Bible, but it is in the Talmud.
Yeah.
So Marcus Brody, or maybe Larry Kasdan, made the same mistake there as von Daniken. But the Jewish Encyclopedia article on this subject, citing the Talmud, says, quote, marching in the vanguard of the Israelites, the ark leveled the hills before them. Another passage says it protected the Israelites from attackers during the journey, and also cleared a path through dangerous country. Quote, 2 sparks came out from between the 2 cherubim, which killed all serpents and scorpions, and burned the thorns, the smoke of which, as it curled upward, sent a sweet fragrance throughout the world. And the nations of the earth exclaimed in wonder and admiration, what is this that cometh up from the wilderness like pillars of smoke? So,
wow.
Maybe the Canaanites would have seen this as laying waste to their region. So even that is not without some basis in tradition.
Finally, what about Marcus saying that an army which carries the ark before it is invincible? Was this really true, as the Bible tells it? Well, it's going to take a minute to parse this question out, fun as it will be to do so. And we've run out of time for this episode. So let's take a break, come back next time, and then continue with what Raiders gets right and wrong about the Lost Ark. Till then, won't you give us a like for this one, leave a comment in the comm boxes, and subscribe if you haven't already. It means a lot for the channel going forward. So long for now from the Popcorn Cathedral.